Words have no meaning. Identity is totally self-generated and socially constructed, and our nation is nothing more than a matter of narrative that can be changed at a moment's notice. This is what the left has been telling us increasingly for many years now. We are living in a culture that is dominated at once by science and the religion of secular science, and also by whatever sort of fantasies we want to construct with which we can build our own reality. I've been trying to make sense of this for a very long time, and I just can't make heads or tails of it. So fortunately, I have been able to call on the expertise of one of our nation's top scientists, Dr. Anthony Rizzi, who is the director of the Institute for Advanced Physics. Dr. Rizzi, you may have heard his name. He gained worldwide recognition by solving an 80-year-old problem in Einstein's theory. I was really close to solving it, so he got it before I did. So I'll have to give him credit there. Holds degrees from MIT and Princeton, and is just all around one of our nation's top scientists. Dr. Rizzi, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Science is the topic of the day, of the decade, would seem to be, in a way, the kind of faith of our culture now. And yet, on the other hand, we're told that really nothing is real, and we can reinvent the whole world simply by saying that it is so. Can you help walk me through this a little bit? Because I think that the left, I'm being kind of silly with some of the points they're making, but the left has been very persuasive at convincing people that whatever they want to do, however irrational, however contradicted by the reality that we all see with our own eyes, that has the credibility of science and therefore cannot be disputed.
Yeah, it's really, really a good summary in a lot of ways. The thing I would add to it is that it's not just the left, it's the right, it's all of us that have adopted this kind of, well, it sounds good to me, and by the way, that you're not very scientific, and so I don't have to listen to you, and but that comes from both. Anytime there's an evil in the world, you have to look for a good that's perverted. If you have a slug that's gone bad, nobody worries about that too much, because he can't do much. It's when you have a modern Germany gone bad. That's when you work. You have a powerful thing gone evil. And so you have to look for a good, and that good is the scientific method. It was a great discovery around the 1600. Most people don't realize they've never really thought about what the scientific method is. And what it is fundamentally, and you can get this at our website, iapweb.org, where I have a bunch of material. We have a bunch of material on this. But the point is that what is it? At the core, it's an equation. So when a scientist talks to you, he really has an equation in the back of his head that he doesn't know how to quite get out. And so that equation becomes for him, and then therefore the world, a kind of symbol replacing reality. And that transmits to everybody that doesn't understand that. People don't understand an equation, so they transmit it as, I get to make up the world as I want. And so there is no attempt really to study and learn from the world in the slow way that is necessary. There's just well, okay, it kind of works. So, and kind of works can mean something really awful as long as you get an output that the larger culture likes. And so you get a really construct-based kind of reality. Like, if it kind of makes sense, if I come up to you and I try to question you, then you say something back to me and I go, wow, okay, that doesn't really work with my system. And I just tweak my system. I don't fundamentally say, well, let me rethink this all. I just tweak it and try to add what you put in. And I never really fundamentally change. And I keep marching down this road. Over the last 60 years, it's been really clear that we shifted from where we used to be to where we are. If you took a person from 1965 and beamed him forward, he would be shocked. He'd probably have a heart attack. What is this, America? Is this the place that, already that people talked about when they came back from Vietnam, the guys that came back from Vietnam, they're in prison camps for 5 years or something, and they were shocked. This isn't the America that I was fighting for. So this is a powerful shift that, modernity is defined by this, as you say, it's science. It's but most people have been sort of left out of the scientific advance, and they sort of take the sort of fumes that come from the science, and then they justify almost anything they want to justify, even though, that you want to say it, but I flunked that physics stuff. In fact, sometimes I'm proud that I flunked that physics stuff, but yet I'm using that physics stuff to justify. It's just
right.
You wouldn't believe it unless you see it.
Unless you see with your eyes, and then you'll be told to deny it. I want to get into this word that you've used repeatedly that I am told doesn't even exist, namely reality. Because for a long time, and I think your point is excellent, that a lot of people on the right have fallen into this trap too. We have taken the abstract dialogue that we all seem to have as evidence that there's no connection between the abstractions and the real world. So for instance, I'm Catholic, so that's my set of values. But someone else maybe is Muslim, maybe someone else is an atheist, and that's their values, and we can never discuss or investigate whether one of those sets of values has any more truth to it than any other set of values. The same could be said of my identity as a man. Maybe my identity could be different than that. Same could be said for the history of our country. You see now, especially with the 1619 Project, what the authors of that project set out to do, in their own words, was to reframe American history as though the reality of it had nothing to do with the question. It was all just about the narrative. So if, as it seems to me, you are disputing this view of the world, how do we recover a reality-based understanding of our politics?
So, it's really strange to first hear. You have to go learn some very basic physics, because physics is the first science. And nobody's saying that because, like I say, we're all kind of a little bit scared to go back to that time where we had a very bad physics teacher and he told us some stuff we had no idea what he was talking about, wrote some equation on them. But it's simpler than that. The founding fathers of this country, bring up the 1690 Project, they weren't trying to form a new economic system. They were really radically doing something that nobody had ever done before. The first time that I'm aware of in human history that you had a principle-based country, one that wasn't based simply on, well, we happen to be in this land area on this island, let's call ourselves a country. Well, we happen to have the same skin color, we happen to have the same this or that random thing. No, this was a principle-based country. It made Chesterton say, America is a funny country. It has the soul of a church. Meaning, I think what he meant by that is a principle-based country. So you can be in Hawaii, which is not disconnected at all, and you're just as much as an American as someone in Kansas City. And so that principle base is where did they get it from? They got it from the basic understanding of nature, which is what the word physics, Aristotle coined the word. It just means nature. The looking at the world around you, what you see, and they built from that. And so that's why, for example, to the man, every single founding father didn't believe in the existence of God. They thought you could know it. They knew the existence of God, so nobody doubted it. And so that's the firm foundation. As you see the world, you see by, there's a book that I recommend that people get to start this process that's called The Kid's Introduction to Physics and Beyond, which takes you from the physical world to God. And it's not just for kids, because it's for all of us missing this sort of connection to the ground up. And that takes you, and so that's the firm position that they had. Look, this is what Americans do. They see evil, they attack it. And so that's what they did. The first Americans really set this tone. Look, injustice needs to be stopped. And so, we want to make friends with the king, and that most people don't realize initially the American founders were hoping that they'd scare them and they'd say, okay, we'll be fair again. But they wouldn't. And so they were forced into a revolution, but they wanted a positive vision. It wasn't just simply negative. They wanted this positive vision that each of us has this high dignity with innate rights that come from our nature, that in turn comes from God, and the God you can know exists. And that so you can make conclusions, as opposed to, as you just said, well, I'll pick this religion. I kind of like the flavor of that religion. There's 32 flavors, and that flavor is the best one for me. And no matter what anybody says, I like that flavor. We even say it. I don't care what you say. That's my flavor.
So I have to pause here, because what you've just said is so radical, and I happen to know that it was once common sense, but it certainly is today, I think, considered an absolute heresy. What you are saying is that from the physical world, we can know things about the metaphysical world. So from the physical objects all around us, using our reason, we can know things about God. We can know things about the world that is immaterial. And we can also know things about how we ought to live together, how we ought to have a government, how we ought to pursue justice. You have just contradicted, I think, every single principle of modern society. How dare you, sir?
Yes, I really have, because I've done two things. One is I've went to a principled core and starting point, whereas you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to start where you kind of like, and I'll say, Michael, I kind of like this. And then you tell me what you kind of like. You're not supposed, and by going to the core, that already violates everything, right? But then number two, I actually point out that you can know things from that with certainty that, that therefore you can't teach the contrary of, for example, in schools. Because, we're starting to get to the point where we can't teach math anymore. And a colleague of mine at Princeton did a nice job of debunking that. But I'm afraid to say, I'm sure you're aware that the new, the Oregon Department of Education has decided that math is unfair because there's multiple answers. Well, that's not what happens when you look at the physical world. There's one answer to 2 + 2 = 4, and that's the one I just gave. And so you have to really, so the point though that is you look at the physical world and physics comes before metaphysics. Because it's only by looking at the physical world that you see that there is a metaphysics, something what Aristotle called metaphysics, something beyond. Meta means beyond the physical. You see that the physical world, by its contingency, immediately shows you the existence of God. So,
Dr. Rizzi, what you mean by that, because I think a lot of people are going to hear what you just said and say, well, I don't know, I can see Michael's leftist tears Tumblr. It does not necessarily follow from the existence of his Tumblr that God exists or that there's something metaphysical out there. So how am I supposed to know this? How is Uncle Aristotle supposed to prove to me that that's true?
The thing I need to say is we have to, this like if somebody came to me and said, tell me how to solve a differential equation, I'd have to walk them from the beginning. Right. So there's some steps there. It's not hard. That's why I sent them to the kids' Introduction to Physics, because you're going to have to take some time to see it the same way you did. We're not used to these things being complex. And we leave. So the reason morality seems sort of random is because we don't spend any time thinking about how you get from the bottom to the top. Right. In the same way that the reason that higher mathematics, and for me, higher mathematics, it means anything more advanced than algebra. But the reason it seems kind of random, it's just because I don't spend any time thinking about it, so I don't have a methodical way of thinking about it. Right. And the difference, though, and that's a great point because it's a great comparison. And the reason that it feels so to you for morality and everybody else is because, unlike math, people spend no time on it. I mean, intellectuals spend very little time trying to go from the beginning to the end. So that doesn't get transmitted to the culture. And whereas there's a lot of time I can tell you spent on math and physics. I mean, it takes the average physicist 17 years after high school to become a physicist. So that shows you the depth of understanding that we have. And that can transmit, in some way to, wow, there's something really important there. You see things like, this cell phone and stuff that proves, whereas you see very little evidence that anybody's been trained morally to think morally. And so you don't see the actions. And so you don't think there's anything there. But if you imagine that math is very simple relative to human nature, you can see that because math has to do with counting parts of stuff. Well, I have parts here, but I'm much deeper than a bunch of parts. So if that's that complicated, as you just said, to get to something beyond algebra is that complicated. Imagine how complicated it is to understand human nature. Right. Of course. So you can't expect to just say like, okay, here's the answer to the derivative of the elliptical integral, any more than you can say, here's why in 2 seconds, here's why you shouldn't punch your neighbor in the face. Right. Right. Well, I love that point. I mean, on the complexity of it all. And I obviously agree with the point you're making, which is so heterodox today, that you can look at the natural world
and derive metaphysical conclusions from it. So let's say that we grant all of that. We direct people to read these introductory books. We direct people to read, say, St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, who baptizes Aristotle. It is said one of the most intelligent people to ever walk the earth. Every crazy blue-haired college student today thinks that she is much smarter than Thomas Aquinas, but I promise she is not. And let's say that I can therefore conclude, okay, my tumbler is contingent. It did not cause itself. It is better than some things, worse than other things, and by ways of argumentation, I can get from that arguments from perfection, contingency, cause, other arguments. I can get all the way up to God. Okay, I see it. I agree. That's why I go to church on Sunday. But why is it the case, Dr. Rizzi, that it seems to me some of the greatest offenders against this reason and some of the greatest promoters of this shallow scientism seem to be these very well-educated, very intelligent scientists themselves?
Well, so that has to do with the core, physics is the first science because everything we know comes through what we know through the senses. And physics is just a study of the physical world. So it shows that us physicists have done a poor job showing the primacy of our field, number one, but it shows we've done a very poor job of getting people to be interested in it and to see that it affects everything. But the fact is because we focus on an equation. So if you ask, if most people know E equals MC squared, right? But what does that mean? I don't see an E equals MC squared inside here.
Right.
Where is that E? And the point is that as a physicist, I have not been trained to spend time asking what. Not just why, but what is this? And so instead, I have equations in my head. So when I'm trying to talk to you, I kind of have to, and when I'm talking to myself and trying to relate this equation to an experiment, I kind of have to invent a story to connect it. It's what in the humanities departments, which where this stuff bleeds to next and gets much worse, they call an account. Let's make an account. What's your account? And I'll tell you my account. And then the account just sort of morphs without anything to contain it or to connect it to reality, only some practical output, which increasingly just becomes, do I fit into the clique? Do I have power? And it just leaves you, but I have to say that most physicists are very shy about this. They kind of know that they don't know anything, unlike the humanities people that should know they don't know anything. The physicist kind of does. So most physicists are pretty shy about talking about, and they'll say things like, well, that's not interesting to me. And what they mean by that is I have no idea how to think about it. So, that's the truth of the matter. There's only a few physicists and people grab onto them that will talk in public because they kind of know that, well, I don't really know how to step out of it. And so what that does is you get stuck in the equation. You go, well, I don't know how to talk about that. I don't know what to do about that. So you dive more deeply in the equation, and that breaks the bond. And that's what's happening to America. It's breaking the bond between nature and your understanding of her. And so as that progress moves, America, which is deeply ingrained in nature, deeply planted in nature, gets more and more broken from nature. And it becomes harder and harder for anybody within that culture to explain what is the true nature of it. And that's why I wrote this article, as you know, What is America? To kind of tell people what it is. It's the first principle-based country in history, one that defines herself by a principle, not by a land mass or skin color or something trivial, but by a principle that says there's a human nature, and from that human nature, certain inalienable rights spring because of the nature made by God, that has certain constraints and certain direction because of that nature. It has a certain ordination, which is an ordination to grow in knowledge and truth and virtue. I mean, this is the founding fathers. So I send people to the What is America article to get them to be inspired by these great men. Washington, for example, was at pains to make sure that his troops were virtuous, were growing in virtue. And he says this. He tries to get them, to use civil language and to not do things that are untoward. And he realizes this is what that's going to make not just the army win, but to make winning worthwhile. And that's universal character of all the founders, of wanting to build in virtue and wanted to be robustly connected with what's real and what's true.
Well, on this question of what our founding fathers were really like, what our country is really all about, I have been reliably informed, Dr. Rizzi, given my long experience of education, K through 12 and all the way up through college. I've been told that our founding fathers were deists who founded a secular country where there is a firm separation between church and state, founded on the principles of liberty, which means being able to do whatever you desire or follow whatever appetites you have. So it would seem to me that you are telling me that everything I've been taught is completely wrong. Could you maybe briefly take us through how that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, that very briefly, yeah, I'd say essentially, you're right. In some areas, we've been told some right things, but essentially, at the core, you're right. We've been given a bad physics, an understanding of the physical world that is confused and even wrong in severe places. That then leads us to these conclusions that that just aren't true. That the founding fathers, like I said earlier, what you have to make a distinction between revelation and natural understanding of the world. And to the man, all of them were on the page. I mean, most of them, by the way, in my book, The Science Before Science, I go through this in another higher level fashion where I explain that you can prove the immortality of the human soul. And they knew that. Pretty much to the man, they knew that. It's not as complete as it is for God, but pretty much, and they knew that there was an external goal to life. And they acted on that, and they all worried about it. In these days of people thinking that America is racist, you can go to the Jefferson Memorial, and on that plaque, it's there. I mean, you can say stuff about Jefferson fell short this or there, but up there we put for ourselves this Jefferson quote that says, I fear for my nation because there is a just God, and slavery is a horrible, monstrous thing. I'm paraphrasing. So, who puts that up there unless this is a calling to something higher? And Jefferson actually said this. So these are people that are worried about the direction. They have a direction that's a higher direction. And Americans have consistently manifested this. You see them, so many people think Americans are, and the Europeans thought this, that Americans were like after money alone or commerce alone. And all you have to do is look at World War II. Right. Where all these things that were supposedly dedicated to commerce alone became dirt poor in order to defeat, in Franklin's word, the mortal enemy of our Christian religion. Not to make more money, but to stop the evil that was happening in Germany.
Right.
And they literally, sacrificed, basic commodities in order to do this. And so that kind of shoots down one of the, the things were individualistic. You don't band together like that if you're just, okay, well, Joe, it's up to you. Die or live yourself.
Right.
This wasn't just Joe next door. This is the guy across the sea. Right. And so this is a radical lie that we're told, that we all tell it to ourselves. We all believe it ourselves. We have to undo that and really come back to what's the reality around us and see that we claim these deep, principled lives that the founders wanted us to have and ensconced in the country.
It seems to me what we're describing as going on today is this exaltation of diversity and subjective feeling or preference as these paramount virtues. And what we're seeing from the founding fathers and all the great men who built our civilization is instead a reliance on unity, a call for unity, and a reliance on objective reality and reason and our ability to know things about the world, the physical world and the metaphysical world too. And those two visions are completely at odds. They are diametrically opposed. But then what do you say to someone who shows up maybe with blue hair, I don't know, I'm just creating an image here, who says to you, well, yeah, Dr. Rizzi, okay, Jefferson, you think he did some good things, but I know he did some bad things too, and so you like him, that's your preference, and I don't like him, and that's my preference, and so why is your narrative about the country any better than my narrative about the country? Yeah,
so that's a really good question. And then the point goes back, is a complex thing, right? To, like, if somebody asks me, how do you prove this derivative is equal to this? I have to send you back to the beginning, and I have to send you back to the material that I talked about. I suggest to this person you start with the What is America article, and then let that lead you to the Kid's Introduction to Physics and the Science Before Science, and the other material that we have to kind of start digesting how you prove things. Because when you know something as opposed to believe something, you prove it. You don't just say it, you prove it. You don't just have enough army of people to enforce it on people. You prove it. And right, that's what the First Amendment of the Constitution was really about. And it's clear that it was about, because they were, there was pamphlets circulating. They weren't trying to force things on people. They were trying to convince people. And the Declaration itself says that I'm going to paraphrase, decent men want to give reasons for their disagreement, and not just to say. So, we've diluted this word argument to mean I yell at you, I call you a few names, you call me a few names back, and whoever, the audience thinks wins by enough jeers and cheers, then wins, But that's not the founders' view. It's not a sane view. It's not Western culture view that it's always been. You have people like, as you mentioned, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose book reads more like a modern-day math book than it does anything else in our culture. He asks a question, and he gives a series of rebuttals to his own question, and then answers them, and he has a proof back to the physics in his answers.
But Dr. Rizzi, I have been told, I've been reliably informed by the very same people who told me all those things about the country and the Founding Fathers. I have been reliably informed that science is opposed to religion. That science and reason and all our wonderful modern brain and mind is opposed to religion. We've only got a couple minutes left, but surely you have to grant their point on that, don't you?
No, I mean, I don't, because what you just said, what we just said is the Founding Fathers are lived examples of it. You see the world, and from that you see that God exists. And that's what most people mean by religion, that there is a God, and what the founders knew, and that's why Thanksgiving was proclaimed by both Jefferson and Washington, that we owe a duty to him, to God. That's what people mean by religion, and you can prove that. And science is about looking at the world and understanding what you can understand about it. The problem is that we've let it become just simply an equation in the minds of the smartest people in our culture, and have been content not to know anything about it ourselves.
Right.
And so then the humanities people who don't have this kind of education, rigorous education, can then tell you things like that they're separate. And in fact, they're right, as long as it's an equation that sits in Never Never Land. Then it's about not religion, it's not about anything that doesn't give human answers even to what something is. Right? So as long as it's that way, then they're right. When you have a science that doesn't really answer what, then not only religion, but your humanity and everything else is left out. And you can say that, but that's only an ignorance that doesn't understand that scientists themselves want that equation, desire that equation to say something real.
This phrase, trust the scientists, has been a very abused phrase in our culture. But I would recommend that people trust this scientist in particular, and especially so because you can use your own powers of reason to follow along in these arguments. I highly recommend that you follow Dr. Anthony Rizzi's work. Dr. Rizzi, where can people find you?
So you can find me at iepweb.org. You just go there, and then there's a link to this America podcast. We're going to be doing a podcast on America here in a couple of weeks, so I hope people will join for that. And just click around there, and there's a phone number and anything else you want to find there. iapweb.org. Head on over. I certainly look forward to hearing more and reading more. Dr. Rizzi, thank you for being with us and clearing up all those misconceptions that I have accumulated over the years. Thank you.